This video will contain spoilers. You have been warned. So I think you guys know that I don't really keep up with the MCU anymore, and I haven't for some time. I've checked a few things out and even done some videos about ones that I'm interested in the past few years, but for all intents and purposes, the last vestige of artistic integrity this universe had went the way of the dodo with Guardians 3, and with that, any further emotional investment from me. But I'm also a massive Spider-Man fan, and if there's one thing that's almost guaranteed to get me to buy a ticket, it's him. I say almost, of course, because there's basically no chance in hell he doesn't play a major role in Avengers Doomsday, and you could not pay me to go watch that movie. I do not care. But with that in mind, I may be a bit out of the loop when it comes to the current state of the world that is the MCU. I never watched season 2 of Born Again or that Punisher special that came out this year, so I may be a little behind on Frank Castle's overall development, but then again, from what I've heard, there wasn't really any development for him in either of those things, and I certainly didn't feel like I was missing much here. This is a character that hasn't actually had anything meaningful going on since like 2019, and Spider-Man Brand New Day did nothing to change my mind on that front. You could go into this movie having never seen anything else he was in and you'd understand him just fine, and I don't really mean that as a compliment. Similarly, I've long since given up trying to keep track of Hulk's whole deal. Endgame had him resolve the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing that he had going on throughout the entire Infinity Saga off-screen, which was really wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Russo brothers. But then Shang-Chi and She-Hulk rolled that back by having him apparently still suppressing the Hulk side of him, which is a major element in the role he plays in this movie. And that's all really sloppy, and it's not really Brand New Day's fault, but if you're gonna include this stuff in the movie, and do so in the way that they did, I kinda don't think you can go without actually acknowledging that as a flaw. The movie takes pains to draw similarities between Bruce and Peter in terms of how Peter is trying to suppress the mutation inside of himself, and how the inhibition of what's ultimately his natural self is bad and wrong, and then it has Bruce lose his inhibitor like halfway through the movie, and for the first time since pre-Endgame, the full Hulk comes out. You'd think he'd be really upset with Banner for suppressing him for all that time, and that there would be some kind of resolution that involved them figuring out how to coexist, but no. Peter somehow manages to get him to calm down by saying that they're buddies, which is news to me. I'm pretty sure last time that took some considerable effort from Black Widow, someone Bruce has an actual connection with, but whatever. He just turns back into Banner, and then he's just gone for the rest of the movie. Like I said, I know trying to have some sort of resolution would have kind of just been a sloppy retread of Endgame, which itself already wasn't great, but again, I really don't think you can incorporate that stuff without doing something to that effect, given how it ties into the themes this movie's trying to go for. What it is really is the movie being one in the last 20 that just doesn't seem to know how to write for this character. The MCU has actually been pretty consistent in their inability to handle Hulk since like Age of Ultron, so this really isn't that surprising. But since I bring up both Hulk and the Punisher, I actually think, the more I think about it, Bruce would have better served the role that Frank ended up playing in this movie. There's one scene with Punisher that I actually thought was kinda neat, if undercooked, and that was when Frank talked to Peter about the loneliness of the life he leads, and tries to impress upon him that he does not want that kind of isolation, how there are people in his life who still care about him, who are still around to care about him, and he should be doing everything he can to be with those people. But you know who else is a character who's dealt with extreme isolation and loneliness, and who might have a word or two of wisdom to say about the value of keeping your loved ones in your life? Bruce Banner. So I don't know, if you're gonna have some other MCU character serve as a sort of pseudo-mentor for Peter here, I think Hulk might have been the better option. Banner is at least an upstanding citizen and one of the most renowned superheroes who exists, someone Peter might theoretically look up to. Punisher is a fucking murderer who Peter should be trying to put in jail, but there are several moments throughout this film where neither he nor anyone else in a position of authority even tries to arrest him. Peter kinda just does the same shit Matt was doing in Born Again, where he kept going, "Hey, stop killing people," and then not actually doing anything to meaningfully stop him. Well, I mean, other than try to kill him, that is. So yeah, like I said, I have some major gripes with how other MCU elements not related directly to Spider-Man are handled in this film, and there are a few other examples we'll get to in a moment, but I am largely gonna try to keep the scope down to what I'm actually familiar with. For example, the movie starts off with a little montage showing what Spidey's been up to for the past 4 years since No Way Home, and said montage gives us insight to the fact that apparently he's been a busy boy, taking down basically every major crime syndicate in New York, which only reinforces the question I had in Born Again regarding what Spider-Man was doing about the Kingpin, or where he was during the whole Sentry conflict. But even worse than that, it tells us that one such crime syndicate was an organization known as the Hand. Yes, that one. At least, I think. Daredevil Season 2 and Defenders handle that entire storyline pretty badly, to the point where I'm not actually sure if I'm meant to believe the Hand ever actually was completely eradicated. Defenders ended with all their leaders getting killed, and seems to imply that that's just the end of their whole organization, but obviously that doesn't really make any sense, and so I'm kind of okay with the idea that some splinter factions rose from the ashes of the previous organization, and maybe these guys are just some offshoot of that. But the film doesn't really explain that, and again, it's not even made clear if they're even associated with the one from the Netflix shows. They're just depicted as a bunch of young ninjas. And apparently after they were defeated, they became employed as a reformed security force for the Department of Damage Control, which Spider-Man finds out about and is just fine with. Peter is actually extremely trusting of Damage Control and basically every other form of official authority in this film, which is a little weird considering how much of a living hell the DODC made his life in the last movie when the world found out he was Spider-Man. He continues to trust Mr. Milchick all the way up until it's revealed he's actually up to some pretty shady shit, but I don't know, if I found out that they were employing a powerful gang of ninjas who used to be connected to one of the biggest shadow organizations in the world, that probably would have sent up some red flags for me. I might even suspect that the Hand is now in control of Damage Control, rather than the other way around. Along those lines, though, they do pull the whole Damage Control were the real villains all along card, but that doesn't mean they were the primary antagonist of the film, and I have a lot to say about that particular character. This is already a spoiler-heavy review, and everyone and their mom already guessed this well before the movie released anyway, so I don't really feel that guilty revealing that the main villain is Jean Grey, played by Sadie Sink. Now, I could make a comment right now about how the Tom Holland films continue to refuse to give him actual Spider-Man villains without either tying them back to Iron Man, some other version of Spider-Man from a different universe, or now in this case, the X-Men, but I don't actually care all that much about faithfulness to the source material, and that she isn't traditionally a Spider-Man villain is far from my biggest issue with her. So Jean Grey has an older sister named Sarah, who also has telepathic powers the same as hers. They're both able to possess other people by invading their minds and bodies, and it's as a result of these powers that they get kicked out of their home by their mom and eventually catch the attention of Damage Control, who come to arrest them to use them for experimentation. They want to figure out how to replicate their powers and give them to people of their own choosing. But what's confusing about this is that we get a flashback scene showing Jean's sister getting arrested while they're at the park, and then Sarah uses her powers to control Jean into running away from the Damage Control officers rather than toward them. She only makes her run like 20 feet or so before letting Jean go, but I guess that's enough to keep the Damage Control people from noticing Jean. It's not made entirely clear how the DODC even know about Sarah and her abilities. Maybe their mom told them, or maybe Sarah got picked up on a security camera or something, but apparently they only know about Sarah and not Jean, because frankly, I don't see any other reason why they wouldn't also be trying to arrest Jean here. And again, it's not like Sarah even had her run that far. My impression of this moment was that they might not have even known Sarah had a sister, and again, I'm not really sure how that's possible, but either way, this results in Jean going on a crusade to try to find where her sister is being held, and that's what ends up getting Spider-Man involved in this story. She possesses some woman to drive a tank into a Damage Control facility with a bomb to blow the place up, though I'm not sure what specifically she was trying to accomplish by doing that. In fact, I'm not actually sure why she needs to do anything noisy in order to secure her sister's freedom, when she could much more easily access the information of Sarah's location by possessing someone with high clearance and Damage Control. But obviously we need Spider-Man involved in this story, and this is the only way we could think to do it, I guess. Now, throughout this whole crusade, Jean Grey is possessing countless innocent people and using them to hurt others, and sometimes themselves. She even has one guy walk into the road and get hit by a car just to prove a point to Spider-Man. And my biggest problem with her character is that by the end of the film, it does not meaningfully recognize her as a villain. Or at the very least, Peter is way too comfortable letting her get away with everything she's done. She gets a happy ending, and that's treated as a good thing, but no, sorry, I just don't buy that. I mean, again, there's the fact that she's hurting people, but it really can't be overstated just how fucked this whole mind control thing is. There's hardly anything more invasive and violating that you can do to another person, and she does it to so many people, it's treated very flippantly. Like that flashback I mentioned earlier where her sister gets arrested starts off with them practicing their abilities on a park bench, using them to jump from person to person, and the scene seems to be depicting this as a fun, innocent thing between two siblings. No one was ultimately hurt, so what's the harm, I guess? And that leads me to believe that the film is not fully aware of the ethical implications of what Jean is actually capable of, meaning it can therefore not meaningfully punish her for them. The film and Peter understand that she's a victim, but nothing is done to recognize at all that she's used her trauma to victimize others, which, is pretty standard supervillain writing that these movies used to understand. Bad people fucking you over does not give you carte blanche to perpetuate the cycle of pain and suffering. And the culmination of this arc is her finally being allowed to enter Spider-Man's mind and witness a flashback to Aunt May that the movie has been teasing all throughout its runtime, where May lays out some fairly generic dialogue about how much she loves Peter and she'll always be there for him. The point of this scene being to remind Peter that he doesn't have to be alone in the world, that he shouldn't let himself be alone, and that neither should Jean. But the only thing I could think here was that, if anything, you'd think she'd only resent Peter all the more after seeing this memory, given her own abandonment that I mentioned earlier. Where Aunt May saw the power Peter had and chose to give him love and support, her mother completely abandoned her because she was afraid of Jean and Sarah's abilities. So you'd think seeing that juxtaposition would only fan the flames of her anger, and I assumed that was why they chose to incorporate such an obvious parallel. But they didn't do anything with that at all. And in fact, this memory is what ultimately made Jean decide to turn good. The memory of a woman she doesn't even know, who represents something she desperately craves, was what it took to make her forget about avenging her dead sister. Oh, yeah, did I mention? This scene is coming right after she learned Sarah had died, and she had the person responsible for that right there at her mercy. So no, I would not say Jean Grey is a particularly great character in this movie. The very premise of her story and how she's chosen to go about conducting herself doesn't really make much sense when you stop to think about it. Her characterization is flimsy and unsatisfying, and the narrative does not acknowledge the actual implications of her role as a villain in this story. Sadie Sink is, of course, doing a phenomenal acting job like she always does, but overall, I was not impressed. And while we're on the subject of villains, I guess I'll round off this point by saying that there are no villains in this movie that I think are particularly well done. We already talked about the stuff to do with the hand, so I won't really get into that again, but there was also Tombstone, who showed up in the movie for about 15 seconds as a sort of villain of the week type deal. And again, I wasn't impressed by that, because I actually would have liked to have more low-to-the-ground actual Spider-Man villains in this Spider-Man movie. But I guess that brings me to the final villain worth talking about, Scorpion. There's not really much to say about his usage here, because he's barely in the film. There's a lot more to be said about what's not done with him. I've been complaining for years now that they absolutely wasted the narrative potential set up at the end of Homecoming and the following sequels. The post-credit scene clearly sets up a dynamic between him and Vulture in prison together, with Scorpion clearly not believing Toomes when he says he doesn't know who Spider-Man is. Gargan also mentions having guys working for him on the outside.
I've got some boys on the outside who'd love to meet him.
Which means if he really wanted to press it, he could use those guys to go after Toomes' family. And then what would Toomes do? Would he stick by his choice to honor Peter's alter ego? Would he fold to the pressure to protect his family? What might Spider-Man have to do to protect Liz and her mom? There was a lot you could do with that, but Far From Home completely drops that by having Mysterio reveal Spider-Man's identity at the end because, so what if Toomes knows Peter's secret? Now everyone does. Then obviously No Way Home comes along and has it so that everyone forgets who Spider-Man is, including Toomes, so now it's I guess you could still have Scorpion trying to squeeze Vulture, because, maybe he just doesn't believe Toomes when Toomes says that he doesn't know, but that doesn't really have the same weight if he just actually doesn't know. Plus then Morbius came along and stole Vulture from the MCU, so I'm not even really sure what I'm meant to do with that anymore.
I'm not sure how I got here. Has to do with Spider-Man, I think.
I'm pretty sure that's not even how the spell works, but whatever. It honestly would have just been funnier if Kevin Feige completely ignored that and had Vulture be in this one. And again, none of that is this film's fault, but with all that in mind, there's kind of not really much you can do with Scorpion other than just ignore him. And sure, I'm always happy to see Michael Mondo in anything, but this lack of weight makes their brief interactions here nothing more than a generic superhero fight. Hell, in one of the fights, it's not even the real Scorpion who's in control. And speaking of the spell, I guess that's the last major thing I feel is worth talking about. No Way Home ended with Peter asking Doctor Strange to cast a spell that would make everyone in the world forget him, and as a result, all records and memories of his existence have ceased to exist. The extent to this isn't entirely clear, I'm not really sure what people remember about Spider-Man and his general history in the world. The film gives us some answers, but is overall pretty vague, which might have been for the best, because if you actually stop to think about the logistics of the spell, you realize pretty quickly that it doesn't really make all that much sense. But that's beside the point. the point is that on a meta level, this was understood to be a sort of soft reset on Spider-Man's story. A lot of people complained about how much this version of the character relied too much on Tony Stark and his technology, or on other superheroes like Doctor Strange, and so to a lot of them, this was seen as a chance to revert Peter back to basics, give him more of a grounded approach, take away all his fancy resources. He ended the film by moving into a shitty little apartment and was, for the first time in a long time, completely alone in the world. Now, I've never been pressed about Peter having Iron Man tech or anything like that. I've long been on the record saying that a thing does not need to be a perfectly faithful adaptation of the source material to be good, and I've always thought the MCU's approach to Spider-Man was an interesting one. I was always fine with it. That being said, I guess I was pretty intrigued to see how they would take Peter's story following the home trilogy. If we're gonna approach this the old-fashioned way, where Peter is this lone wolf type operating out of his pajamas, really being that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, then sure, I'm here for it. So you can imagine how funny I found it when the trailers and stuff started coming out for this movie, and it became immediately clear that that was not gonna happen. It's yet another Spider-Man movie featuring 1,000 different MCU or other Marvel characters who have little to nothing to do with Spider-Man, or at least this version of Spider-Man, and he would continue to rely on tech and other shit like that. Now, I guess the idea here is supposed to be that it's his own tech that he created, so maybe the fanboys will finally be happy. It's basically the same as before, but at least Peter made it himself rather than having it handed to him on a golden platter. If it were me, and the idea was to ground him to more classic elements of the character, I probably would have done without the AI voice companion gimmick, and I'm definitely going to question how this broke immigrant who seemingly doesn't have a day job is affording this extremely spacious apartment with a 4-monitor setup and a kick-ass treadmill, but whatever. I'm just saying, if the Raimi fans were getting mad at this character having way too many resources before, I hope they'll apply that consistently here. But anyway, beyond the surface level stuff, there's also the fact that both MJ and Ned were brought back for this movie, which I definitely would not have done. I guess you could say the whole point was that Peter would overcome his caution that drove him to avoid his friends for all those years, that he'd go on an arc that allowed him to let people back into his life, but I don't necessarily know that those people needed to be Ned and MJ. I think you could just as easily have that happen with a new cast of characters. Introduce people into Peter's life that he's initially unwilling to get too close to, but who eventually tear down his walls and help him open up. And as for MJ and Ned, theirs could be a somewhat tragic ending, where they know they've lost something, but will simply never know what or who, and maybe they really are better for it. That being said, I'm not going to act like I disliked their inclusion. I have extremely specific thoughts regarding the characterization and some of the logistics of how the spell works, what exactly these characters remember about Peter and about Spider-Man that I've been having trouble working out in my mind, and I don't really want to get into all that here because it would really bog down the pacing of this review, but the long and short of it is that I definitely think we are just going to have it that their memories eventually return to them over time, which again, I'm really not a fan of. I was actually kind of on board with the mature resolution we seem to be getting, where Peter understood and accepted that MJ just doesn't know him and therefore can't feel love for him the same way he does. He can still try to rekindle his friendship with them both, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll manifest itself into anything more than that. Sort of a Quill and Gamora thing all over again. But like I said, there are way too many hints at the idea that both of them are capable of slowly regaining their memories of Peter, and it's pretty obvious MJ still has lingering feelings for him that she previously couldn't place. So I just know that the next movie is going to do some really forced relationship drama with her and her boyfriend, and I'd really rather not. None of that is necessarily a mark against this movie, but all I'm saying is the seeds have been planted, and I'm not necessarily a fan of what they're going to grow into. The MCU Spider-Man run has generally been very conflicting for me. I do like the character and Tom Holland's performance therein, but the writing has been largely subpar at the best of times. His strongest outing by far was Homecoming. That's a movie with a lot of flaws, but it also gets a lot more hate than it deserves, and I think there are a lot of common criticisms made against it that just are not valid. But then there's all the Avengers crossover stuff with him, and none of that was particularly great, nor were Far From Home and No Way Home. I could honestly do a video about the entire Home trilogy someday, but the basic through line here is that Tom Holland's Spider-Man is just one of many heroes in the MCU pantheon who's been plagued with shitty writing. This movie was no exception, and I didn't really expect it to be. It gets a 4 out of 10. And I want to make something clear, because I know I have this reputation of being really mean and hating everything or whatever. That score is my estimation of the film's overall quality as I see it, for all the reasons I mentioned above, and for many that didn't make it into the review. But like I said at the beginning, I'm a really massive Spider-Man fan, and I enjoyed this movie just fine. It's actually really hard to make me not like a Spider-Man movie, even if it's bad. And there's also a lot of great stuff here worth appreciating. The action and direction are both generally better than in the John Watts trilogy. The combat is clearly inspired by the Insomniac games, and that's a positive because the combat in those games is really good. It's just that overall, it's not a very good movie writing-wise, and no amount of coming after me for that take in the comments is going to change my assessment of it. But hey, speaking of me actually liking stuff, Brand New Day isn't the only live-action Spider-Man thing we've gotten this year. There was a little show that came out a few months ago that I really didn't see a lot of people talking about, and that I myself put off watching for a bit just because I was kind of busy. But it's really good, and it deserved a lot more attention. I am, of course, talking about Spider-Noir, which I would go so far as to say is the best live-action Spider-Man that we've ever gotten. Raimi fans can suck my dick. I'm not gonna spoil anything about this show. I'm just gonna tell you all to go watch it and thank me later. I'd personally recommend checking it out in black and white, but it's shot in a way where it still really does look good in colors, so honestly just do whatever you want. Just watch it. I give it an 8 out of 10.